the ultimate goal of ensuring that our students get what they deserve, which is the best educational experience possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Allen. Any other opening comments from commissioners? All right, thank you again. We'll move on to section 3.02, public comments. In order to minimize the risk of exposure for members of the public sharing the same microphone at the podium, we will continue to receive public comment through our online portal. Please note that we continue to monitor all relevant public health data, and assuming that positivity levels remain low, we are optimistic that we will again be able to restore a modified version of in-person comment in April. But again, that assumes that positivity rates remain low. The public comment portal was activated on Tuesday, March 16th, and remained open until 4 p.m. this afternoon. The board received 11 public comments submissions. These comments were shared with commissioners via email and are posted to tonight's board docs and items 3.02. Moving then on to the consent agenda, section 4. Are there any questions or requests to remove any items from the consent agenda as posted? Do I have a motion to approve this evening's consent agenda as presented?
So moved. Second.
We have a first and a second. Do we have any comment? All right, Mr. Bernlohr, please call the roll.
Commissioner Allen?
Yes.
Commissioner Arnold?
Yes.
Commissioner Pritchard? Yes. Commissioner Slack?
Yes.
Secretary Collins?
Yes.
Vice President Moore?
Yes.
President Hawkins?
Present. Thank you, Mr. Bernlohr. Moving on to section 5.0. I guess I just want to begin by saying that the recent anti-Asian hateful rhetoric and violence, most recently the horrific murders in Atlanta, Georgia, are once again a reminder that people of color of all types continue to be victimized by racist and hateful systems and behaviors and systems that have been in place for a long, long time. Many of the recent images most certainly conjure up feelings of anger and sadness, which in no way can compare to the pain that our fellow Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters here in Indianapolis and across the nation are feeling today and have been feeling for some time. This past June, this body adopted the racial equity mindset, commitment, and action policy. That policy drew a line in the sand and demands that IPS be a place that respects and honors the richness of our diverse school communities and our shared and often painful history. It renewed IPS's commitment to justice that our Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters so deserve. I also would like to add and thank a group of special students from Shortridge High School, and specifically the National Chinese Honor Society, for sharing your valued thoughts, perspectives with this board and administration, and know that those perspectives will be considered and reviewed. And so again, I want to thank each of you for your submission to this board and to the administration. Before we vote on this resolution this evening, I would also like this resolution to be read into the record. And following the reading of Resolution 7885, I would ask that the board, guests in this room in person, as well as those that might be tuning in, might observe a moment or a brief moment of silence with us collectively as we reflect on the lives taken during this wave of extreme hate. So with that being said, Commissioner Slack, would you please introduce the resolution?
Thank you, President Hawkins. Today, the IPS Board of Commissioners presents this resolution in an act of affirmation and support of our Asian American and Pacific Islander community here in IPS. Hatred and bigotry have no place in our classrooms. It is our purpose to ensure that every student, staff member, without regard to skin color, national origin, or ethnicity, feels safe and welcome in their classroom or place of employment.
Whereas actively fostering a welcoming and inclusive environment for all people, and particularly all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, or place of origin, is a core value of the Indianapolis Public Schools Board of Commissioners, and
whereas fear and ignorance about the COVID-19 pandemic has led to scapegoating and anti-Chinese sentiments manifesting in a rise in hateful rhetoric, false accusations, and reports of bullying, harassment, and deadly violence directed at people of Asian heritage across the country. And
whereas misinformation about the coronavirus and associated false allegations of blame, including those made by current and former elected officials, have impacted the well-being of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and those perceived as such, threatening the livelihoods and physical safety of members of these communities, and imperiling the ability of students to learn in a safe and welcoming environment. And
whereas the Board of Commissioners is committed to combating xenophobia, racism, and discrimination, and to creating safe and welcoming learning communities for all IPS students. And
whereas the Board of Commissioners strives to create a place where individuals and families of all backgrounds feel safe and are treated with respect, dignity, and are recognized for their contributions to building a strong and vibrant school corporation.
Therefore, be it resolved by the Board of School Commissioners that the Indianapolis Public School Board of Commissioners denounces discrimination, harassment, and violence against any individual or community, including those of the Asian American Pacific Islander descent or perceived as such. We call upon our school community to denounce these acts and to make extra effort to ensure the safety and well-being of all students, staff, and members of the IPS community.
thank you, Commissioners. If we can observe a moment of silence. Thank you. Commissioners, do I have a motion to approve Resolution 7885, a resolution in support of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community?
so move.
second.
I have a few firsts and a few seconds. Any discussion? Mr. Burnler, please call the roll.
Commissioner Allen?
Yes.
Commissioner Arnold?
Yes.
Commissioner Pritchard? Yes. Commissioner Slack?
Yes.
Secretary Collins?
Yes,
Vice President Moore?
Yes.
President Hawkins?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Burnlor. We will now consider, moving on to Section 6, we will now consider the school year 21-22 budget. I will now turn this portion of the agenda over to Superintendent Johnson.
Thank you, President Hawkins, and thank you to you and commissioners for that resolution of support and solidarity with our Asian American Pacific Islander community. Our district team proudly stands with you. I had the pleasure of meeting with 2 young men from the National Chinese Honor Society just earlier today, and I'm excited to continue to engage in conversation with them as they have further challenges for the work that we can do to support their community more robustly, and I look forward to being able to have the opportunity to do so. Over the course of the last several weeks, Weston Young, our Chief Financial Officer, has updated the board on the budget appropriations process as required by state statute. A public hearing was held on March 15th, and we can now move forward with formal approval. On Tuesday evening, we reviewed the accompanying requests for authorization that are also posted along with the budget appropriation request. I'll turn it over to Weston in case there are any additional information to provide, and then we will request the board's approval of the budget as presented.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. We've reviewed this at multiple meetings. The information is available. It's been advertised as required, available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Any questions, commissioners, for Mr. Young? Okay, well, thank you. So unless there are objections to doing so, accept a motion to approve resolutions 3001-21 through 3007-21. This again would be a resolution to combine all of the individual resolutions into one resolution, approving the 21-22 budget appropriation and related matters as presented. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Mr. Brunler, please call the roll.
Commissioner Allen.
Yes.
Commissioner Arnold.
Yes.
Commissioner Pritchard. Commissioner Slack.
Yes.
Secretary Collins.
Yes.
Vice President Moore.
Yes.
President Hawkins.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Brunler. I'll now turn the agenda back to Superintendent Johnson for superintendent reports.
Thank you, President Hawkins. On Tuesday, let me find my notes, get to the right place. On Tuesday, we heard from school leaders Heather Varno and Carly Robbins, who shared about the great things happening at Seidner Academy as a part of our school spotlight for this month. So I want to, again, publicly thank them for being here and sharing with us about the incredible work that's happening this year at Seidner on this particularly challenging year. Item 7.01 this evening is a report on the transportation planning that is underway. Zach Mulholland and I will co-present this evening. We do have some guests who are here with us to talk about some of the proposed shifts and the experiences they've had thus far with transportation. And so we're going to have them go first because they have schools to run and attend tomorrow. And so I would invite, Zach, do you want to sort of call up the order before we get started in the presentation?
I'll ask Principal Franklin to come up, and then you can, I know these are all addicts folks, so you can coordinate.
Good evening, Commissioners and Superintendent Johnson. As always, it is a delight to stand before you. I will say the last time I was before you at Crispus Attucks for the board retreat, someone asked me about the Crispus Attucks Converse tennis shoes. They were released today, so you can order those on Converse.com and Footlocker.com. So just if I ordered a pair right before I came. So with that said, I was asked to speak tonight about my perspective around the Indigo partnership and what it meant to our school community at Crispus Attucks. And so I just wanted to highlight a few things, but overall I'm going to turn it over to my capable staff and student and her mother. They have some great things to say. So we piloted the program for the last 2 years at Crispus Attucks, and it was received in a very positive manner from our students. Students were able to just appreciate another mode of transportation. It provided them with a level of independence and freedom and just kind of autonomy to move around the city that they did not previously have before. And so that was something that was very welcome by several of our families. Probably the majority of our families really welcomed it. We did not necessarily see a decline in yellow bus transportation, but our students really appreciated the flexibility that they had to hop on the Indigo when they had to go to work. And so they didn't have to do the process of the temporary bus pass where I'm riding the bus home today, but I got to go home. I got to go to work tomorrow. So they were able to have that flexibility and really appreciated it. I would also say that we did have a dedicated staff member, Mrs. Kiana Davis, and she's the best face liaison in the district. I can brag about her. But she was very dedicated to the partnership, and she would literally sit down and map out the routes with students so that they understood exactly where they were going to go, how they were going to get there. And so our parents really felt safe and assured that we weren't just kind of turning them over to the transportation department, but they knew that we were kind of hand-holding them along the way. And so our families really appreciated that aspect of what we did at our school. Students were able to utilize Indigo for their internship opportunities, field trips, after school sometimes. The after-school buses sometimes would take a lengthy time to get home because there were several students on the bus. And so a lot of our kids opted to, after basketball practice, after track practice, to hop on Indigo because it did shorten their commute. And so again, just that flexibility and that freedom to be able to do that was greatly appreciated by our students. And then lastly, I would say that we have 4 classrooms of students with severe disabilities, and for them to be able to hop on the bus and to learn the bus system and to be able to go out into the community, and knowing that that was a mode of transportation that they would use on a regular basis, that's also something that our families truly appreciated. So I won't say very much more other than as a principal, then I can appreciate the necessity and the logic for making the move that we're making, and I think that it will be embraced by our school community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my Family and Community Engagement Liaison, Ms. Kiana Davis, and then she will introduce our student and parent.
Good evening, everyone. So I am the Family and Community Engagement Liaison at Crispus Attucks High School. I was tasked with the task of helping families kind of embracing the Indigo when it was piloted to us, and I took it and went full steam ahead with it. Through my knowledge of what I have noticed, that students use their passes for more than just school. In the fall, when our sports were happening while we were still fully virtual, many students used Indigo to attend practices, to get to and from, because their practices were happening while parents were still at work and they were not already in the building. Many students who ride the yellow bus still use their passes to get to and from their jobs or from one house to another in the city. Also, our life skills students use this bus regularly to get to and from their employment opportunities during the school day. In the past, students that have overslept, when their parents call in and say that they have overslept, they have been instructed to get on the Indigo to get to school. Prior to the Indigo partnership, I personally have rode the Indigo or Metro, what it was called when I was in school, one time in my life. I was nervous about my limited knowledge concerning busing in Indianapolis and how to answer parents' questions. It was through my multiple trainings, district and building level, that I gained the knowledge. Google Maps is my preferred training tool when interacting with families and students for mapping students' bus routes when riding the Indigo. Many students, after a one-on-one session with me, are fully capable of navigating the Indigo system. I believe strongly a parent pass will help in alleviating some of the parents' fears in students riding the bus. I do think winter routes and how often buses are delayed during the winter is something to consider or possibly ask Indigo about in the future. I'm now going to call up Brianna Peacock and her mother, Miss Peacock, to speak on their experience with the Indigo.
Thank you so much for inviting us here this evening. I'm Dana Peacock. This is my daughter, Brianna Peacock. She's a 10th grader at Crispus Attucks High School in the Health Science Magnet program. She has utilized the public transportation system very much so for these past couple of years. I also want to thank you all for providing the free Indigo Pass. She's been able to get back and forth to school with the after-school programs during this pandemic and the e-learning and the hybrid schedule. She's able to make it to school. And then also she's involved in youth programs around the city of Indianapolis where she's been able to get there as well. With my work schedule, I'm not always able to provide her transportation to those different activities, so it's been a saving grace for her. I would say that the yellow bus, the school bus, for me is a little more better in regards to the students because of safety concerns for me as a parent. So I'm not 100% on board with her maybe having to fully ride the Indigo bus for transportation to school. But if that has to be done, that's fine if it becomes mandatory. I just think in regards to safety issues with the school bus, the bus stop is like 8 houses down from our house. So with her having to get on the bus like 6:30 in the morning, it's dark in the mornings. So that provides me being like right there, 2 minutes away from her if there was any type of dangerous situation that she gets involved in or that comes about with her. But as far as the public transportation, the Indigo, she would have to walk a further distance, which would be out of my eyesight, my earshot, and I wouldn't be able to get to her as quick if needed be. So she does use this app on her phone, which gives her direction and navigates her with the public bus system, which she did have to learn. She never had rode the public bus before getting this free pass with IPS. So I can let her speak on more because she's the one that's actually riding the system. So she can provide a little more insight into that service.
Hello, my name is Brianna Peacock. I am a 10th grader at Crispus Attucks High School. I participate in volleyball and track. So oftentimes I ride the bus home from school after practices. I would say it's a lot, very, very efficient for when, my mom isn't able to take me places or pick me up from places. It's very efficient. But one piece of advice I would give is be very attentive, like for the children. Be attentive, pay attention to everything that's going on around you because the bus systems, like public transportation, it is a lot going on. There's a lot more that you have to pay attention to. You're not accounted for on those buses. So you need to, kind of be more conscious of your surroundings and where you are. The app I use is called Move It, MOOVIT. It's very precise. It tells me what bus to get on, what time to be there. I'm able to follow it through every stop I go through. I get notifications when it's time for me to get off the bus. So yeah, that app is very helpful. But I think for making us go to public transportation every day of the week to go to school early in the morning, you guys should have more of like a safety system going on. So I think maybe having like a buddy system where students that live in the same area are able to be at the bus stop at the same time, ride the bus at the same time, walk to school at the same time together so that parents are less concerned about their one child being at the stop by themselves early in the morning while it's dark. But I think all in all, the public transportation, it is very effective and efficient.
I do have one more thing, a suggestion in regards to the public transportation. Also, I think that it would be great if maybe there was one bus designated in the morning where it's only with the high school children and not the general public. And that way, even with her, because there's not a lot of children that's in my immediate area that is a Crispus Attucks student. So maybe, being on the same bus should be able to still be around her school, her friends, and have her, and it still will be a great provision for safety.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. Oh, it looks like you might have some questions.
Oh.
Commissioner Moore.
What side of town do you live on to get to Crispus? Do you live on the west side, east side, north side, south side?
I would call it Central. We're right there at College and 38th Street.
College and 38th. Okay, and you said in the beginning, I think I heard you say that you didn't really have any major safety concerns. Is that correct?
That I did not have any?
Right.
Yes, I do.
No, I mean, when she was riding the bus, she didn't have any major safety concerns.
Well, she has gotten nervous a few times on the public bus while, riding it to the different destinations she needs to go. As far as the general public, there are some colorful people that are on the bus.
Right.
So that's where I just thought that, maybe designating one bus only for the high school students with the Indigo, that it will, not have the general public also on the same bus.
Okay. Did you have to change bus, sweetie? Did you have to change bus, or did it take you straight to Crispus Attucks?
There's two different bus routes that I personally will be able to take. One is actually on the red line, but it does drop me off at 9th and Capitol, so it's about a 15-minute walk from there to the school. The other bus, I do have to transfer, but it drops me off at the transit center. I catch a second bus, and that one drops me off right outside the school. But I have found that it does take longer than like when I get on the red line.
The transit, when you transferred, it took longer, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any commissioner questions for our wonderful visitors and guests? Thank you, Peacock family, for that
Thank you.
presentation, both of you.
Zach, are we good with guest speakers? Yes? Okay, excellent. Thank you, Addicts family, for being here, Principal Franklin, Ms. Davis, Peacock family, for taking time to be here this evening. I appreciate it greatly. So we will go into the presentation after having heard some of the experiences that some of our students and families in schools have had so far. So Zach and I are going to double team this a bit, so I think he'll drive and I will start us off. So for this conversation, we want to first set the context of the financial landscape and current state of our transportation operations, review with the board our recommended actions for next school year, and then outline some of our next steps and engagement opportunities. In terms of our strategic plan, this initiative and the work that we're doing is aligned to strategic priority number 4, operate and fund strategically. Specifically, we are looking at ways to implement cost reduction strategies across the district so that we can ensure stability and high quality and consistency in our classroom teaching and learning environments. And so this is an effort to ensure those reductions and savings we're finding are not impacting directly our classrooms. So a little bit of the context financially. You all have seen this slide a number of times. And this is essentially telling us that if we do nothing with the current budget forecast, we would find ourselves at a deficit very shortly. If we assume that we have some modest improvements, either because we've reduced modestly some expenses or we've brought in some modest revenue, you can see that that deficit goes out a little bit longer before we sort of hit a fiscal cliff, or the purple line, which represents making strategic decisions, both in generating revenue, but also reducing expenditures year over year so that we can stabilize our financial outlook. And so again, the efforts that we're taking are all in the effort to ensure we're hitting that purple line over time as a district. Additionally, we know that in 2018, our community supported the district in our efforts around the 2018 both operating and capital referendum, which was to be able to have competitive compensation for our teachers and staff and invest in the safety and security of our facilities. That referendum was passed at $220 million over 8 years, which was a significant reduction, those of you who were on the board at the time, from what that initial ask was. And during that time, then Superintendent Dr. Lewis Fairby sort of forecasted and foreshadowed some of the decisions we'd have to make, things around transportation services, things around use of facilities, and around our ability to stay competitive with compensation. So this is an issue that we've been aware of for some time. We've put some things in place to be able to address it, and we think it's time now, particularly as it relates to transition, as it relates to transportation, that we can make some of the transitions that we've been piloting over the past couple of years. So what we know about our transportation is we run a pretty high cost but high degree of service student transportation system. We've had a number of external studies performed that all have confirmed that IPS spends about 1.5 to 2 times more per student on transportation than similarly situated large urban school districts. We know that if we did every single thing that we could do as it relates to transportation spending, we could actually recoup about $17 million in annual potential savings. We also know to pull on every single lever is not tenable at this time. So again, we believe what we are proposing is a strong first step in having some of those savings from transportation and getting more in line with what similarly situated districts expend in their transportation services. This is a graph that basically just represents what I just said. I think we have reduced spending in transportation, so I do want to make that clear, and we'll talk about some of the things that we've done over time to reduce those costs, and even still, we still find ourselves above the spending when you look at other districts who are similarly situated. And what are some of those efforts that we've taken over time? Since 2015, we've leveraged the 4 strategies you can see here. So we leased over 100 new fuel-efficient propane buses. That was to cut down on maintenance, increase fuel efficiency and savings from our spending on fuel. We changed our school bell structure, again, so that we could pair routes more efficiently, again, reducing costs for bus routes. That was in 17-18. In 18-19, we shifted some of our after-school and extracurricular busing. And then you all remember that we fully outsourced our transportation services to a new partner last year in order to, again, recoup some savings in the cost of transporting our students to and from school each day. So a number of strategies we've leveraged over the past 6 years to continue to bring those transportation costs down. And what we've identified as the reasons for some of those excess expenditures that we see in transportation, you all are also fully aware that we run a very expansive school choice model. And so we transport students from all sides of town to other sides of town. That comes at a cost with transportation. For our schools, particularly our Innovation Network schools who have autonomy with respect to their school day length and their start and end times, we've been able to accommodate those requests for different school schedules. We've had a culture and a commitment to a high degree of service, so being very responsive when families have requested shifts or changes over time. And those things, those exceptions and accommodations for families have compounded over time and almost become baked into our policies and practices, which we'll also bring up here in a moment. And then you have just the unique geography and demographics of Indianapolis, all of these things contributing to and taking into account how far our district stretches from east to west and from north and south. And so all of those things combined create additional costs for transportation services to be provided in IPS. So I'll turn it over to Zach. He and the team have been working incredibly hard to think about ways that we can responsibly and sustainably shift in some of our transportation modes to support our students, but also realize some savings.
All right, thank you, Superintendent Johnson. And before I get into the recommendations for 21-22, it's too late to embarrass her, but I wanted to thank Principal Franklin and the student and family from IPS and Kiana Davis, the FACE liaison there. She was a classmate and friend at Harshman Middle School and Arsenal Tech with me, and so we go way, way back. I won't say how far, but she's outstanding. It's always good to see fellow IPS grads who are continuing to be engaged in the district and continue to support our students and families. So I will text her afterwards, but I didn't have the opportunity to embarrass her in public. So I want to follow up and appreciate the lead in from Superintendent Johnson, kind of setting the financial context and kind of looking at the current state of IPS transportation. So what we're going to get into is a little bit of an update on what the transportation team is doing with respect to some of our planning for the 21-22 school years, and review and look at some of the recommendations we have with respect to the shifts for the coming school year. So the major initiatives and efforts really are concentrated in 3 areas. So one, and we heard from students and families, is related to the extension and implementation of our Indigo partnership. And so I'll talk a little bit about that further, but we're looking at some opportunities to look at the next iteration, the next step in that partnership with Indigo, and how we can both continue to serve students and provide a high quality and reliable transportation, but also generate some potential savings through that partnership. We're looking at our walk zone policy and implementation of that walk zone policy across the district. And then finally, some route optimization. And so route optimization is a kind of a category that would include how we route our students daily, how we pair buses, and how we assign and designate bus stops. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of these as we go forward. So starting with Indigo, and many of you were on the board at the time, these conversations have gone on for a number of years. So even going back into the early 2000s, there have been conversations between IPS, between Indigo, about opportunities to both reduce replication and redundancy of transportation services and look for opportunities to partner to serve our students and families' transportation needs. And so lots of conversation and discussions about that. Some of those conversations have been limited, frankly, just by the ability and capacity of Indigo to serve that need on a day-to-day basis. And so The IPS school board and the Marion County taxpayers supported a public referendum that raised additional revenue for Indigo that allowed them to enhance and expand their transit networks, and then ultimately to support the deployment and execution on the Red Line project. So that was a significant, obviously, federal dollars that came to support that and significantly increased the frequency and reliability of that network through their bus rapid transit expansion. And so that really was part of the conversation and the impetus as we begin to seriously explore what that engagement with Indigo might look like. And so in 2018, we initiated a small pilot that was limited to a small number of students at Shortridge initially, and then expanded to Arsenal Tech to just explore the feasibility of that. And so get some initial data and feedback from students who are using that transit network, and explore that opportunity and what opportunity might exist to expand that. And so got really positive feedback from school leaders, from the students and parents that participated in that initial pilot, and based on that decided to engage and execute a memorandum of understanding with Indigo in 2019 that expanded that pilot to include all IPS high school students in school year 2019-20 and 2020-21, the current school year. And so, again, they have a 2-year agreement that runs through this summer. So current IPS students continue to have those universal Indigo transit passes. So if Indigo is running, our students can ride it. So nights, weekends, during spring break coming up, summer breaks, summer jobs, all of those things. And so really excited both to provide them with some mobility enhancements and to continue to move forward with that partnership with Indigo and continue to think about how we can continue to work together, and as both two public institutions in the city, how we can think about being good stewards of taxpayer dollars while continuing to provide a high degree of service to the community and to the students that we serve. And so we did hear some concerns. I know, obviously, the student just about safety on buses. And obviously, we wouldn't be making recommendations with respect to Indigo if we didn't feel confident both in their ability of Indigo to provide safe, reliable transportation to our students. But also, we have a lot of rides. I think during that 2-year pilot program, we've had over 150,000 rides on Indigo from IPS students. And so I think we have a lot of data that demonstrates that not only the efficacy and efficiency of students utilizing that service, but also the safety of Indigo Transit. And so really have gotten a lot of positive feedback from students and families. And as a parent who isn't too far off from having a student that would be covered by this partnership, I can appreciate the concerns as a parent. And what's interesting, I think, is more often, I think some of the safety concerns are heard that you hear from parents are you hear less often from the students, and sometimes they're more capable and more independent than sometimes as a parent you might give them credit for. But again, 150,000 rides we've had over the last 2 years, and so really pleased with the feedback we've got and the level of service that have been provided. So what we are recommending with respect to the 21-22 school year is that students who meet the following criteria be provided the Indigo Transit Network pass in lieu of their yellow bus assignment. So for students who meet these criteria, they would be transitioned to Indigo for their primary daily AM/PM commute to school and would no longer receive yellow bus services. And those students are students that have less than a total 15-minute journey time on Indigo. And when I say journey time, that means the time to walk to the bus stop, a time to wait for the bus, and then the total ride time on the Indigo. So an all-inclusive kind of leaving their house to arriving at school, a total estimated journey time of no more than 50 minutes. And for context, on our yellow bus services, we kind of have a maximum ride time of 80 minutes. And so, again, most of our students are below that, but just the nature of routing and because of the location of students and the schools, we set a maximum ride time on our yellow buses of 80 minutes. And it's important to note also, based on the students that we're recommending shifting, the average expected journey time would be just 24 minutes for those students. So less than a 15-minute total journey time, less than a 0.7 total walk distance to total walk distance. So that is from their home to their initial stop that they get on the bus, and then finally at their final stop to the school, no more than a 0.7 walk distance. And the reason we set that parameter there is because that's aligned to our guidelines with respect to high school stop location. And so, again, we try to set a maximum walk distance for a high school student to no more than 0.7 miles to their yellow bus assignment. And so, again, most students, the vast majority of students are significantly lower than that, but we set that there so it's aligned to the same sort of set of guidelines that we use for our yellow bus stops. Finally, we have no transfers. And so the student that shared with you earlier indicated that there are 2 routes that she can use to get to Crispus Attucks. And so what we decided, particularly as we think about what this first year looks like, again, even though it would be 2 years for many of these students who have had opportunities to ride Indigo, this will be a shift. This will be the first time that we're not only providing the Indigo, but then removing that yellow bus service. So we realize that is a significant shift for the districts and for the students, and there's going to be an adjustment and accommodation for that. And so one of the criteria that we established is that no transfers. And so this means when the student gets on that bus, they're on the same bus to their final stop that brings them to the school. So there's no transfer at the downtown transit center or otherwise. And so thought that particularly given wanted to make sure that we're executing and supporting that really strongly in the first year. Obviously, that's a potential point of confusion or a failure point that in this first year, as we take this next step, that we wanted to eliminate that as a potential failure point. So again, looking at that threshold, so the 0 transfers, 0.7 total walk distance, and no more than a 50-minute total journey time, there are about 600 students that we expect in school year 21-22 that would be affected by this recommendation. So that is 600 students that we would say, based on your residence and your school of enrollment, we believe Indigo can serve your daily transportation needs, and you'll no longer receive a yellow bus transportation assignment. As I noted earlier, again, these students have an average total journey time of 24 minutes. So from the time they leave their front door to the time they arrive at school, just 24 minutes estimated average journey time for those students. And for 87% of those students that we're recommending for shifting the 21-22 school year, they will have a shorter journey time on Indigo than they do on their current yellow bus assignment. So for many of these students, this will be maybe give them a few extra minutes to sleep in the morning. And so I know as a parent of a near teenager, I think that might be some appreciation for that for those students. But again, a shorter journey time estimated on Indigo than their current yellow bus assignment. In addition to the 600 students that we're recommending for mode shifting and shifting to Indigo in school year 21-22, we'll also continue to offer Indigo Universe Passes to any student that chooses to opt into Indigo. And so, again, we would ask those students to no longer to functionally opt out of yellow bus service, but in lieu of that yellow bus, they would then get the Indigo Pass. And so we know there again, 150,000 rides in the last 2 years. And so there may be students who have become familiar with the Indigo network and say, are not intimidated by that one transfer at the transit center and are just kind of Indigo pros at this point and really familiarize themselves and come to rely upon that Indigo Pass. For any of those students or families who say, I want to continue to utilize Indigo for my AM and PM transit to school, then we'll allow any of those students to opt into the Indigo and participate in 21-22. What we'll also do is for students who meet a plausible journey, and we've defined a plausible journey as students who have 1 transfer or less than a 1 mile total walk, so expanded from that 0.7, and less than a 60-minute journey, so just pushing that journey time out an additional 10 minutes. When you use those criteria and parameters, there are about 2,700 IPS high school students who meet that criteria. And so, again, we would only be shifting the 600 that meet the criteria that we outlined earlier, but for those 2,700 students, which would include the 600, so the 2,100 students that meet that additional criteria, we do some targeted engagement and communication. And so let them know about the Indigo opportunity, give them some information about their estimated ride time, and then encourage them and provide some supports for them to consider opting out of IPS transportation and then opting into the Indigo partnership in 21-22. So do some targeted engagement and outreach to those students. So why are we proposing shifting high school students onto Indigo? So as I reviewed, this is what we see as kind of the next step in the partnership and engagement that we've had with Indigo. And so I think this has always been a part of the conversation and planning, is that at some point this was the goal was to begin thinking about how we could, again, reduce duplication of services, continue to provide a high degree of transportation services to IPS students, but also being good stewards of the taxpayer support that are provided both to IPS and Indigo Network. So thinking about this as being the next step in that partnership. Moving towards a flexible multimodal transportation network that continues to provide a high quality degree of service to students. And so again, thinking about how we can continue to think about what the next the future vision of IPS transportation is, given so many of our shifts with respect to our school buildings and our strategic investments in school choice, how we can think creatively and effectively about how our transportation system both supports that model and continues to provide a high degree of transportation to our students. As Superintendent Johnson reviewed, both because of some of those intentional investments that we've made and decisions we've made with respect to schools, but also some of the existing legacy costs associated with our transportation. We have a high-cost transportation service, so wanted to think about how we can reduce those costs, continue to provide degree of service, and to keep some of those necessary cost reductions out of the classroom that are not impacting the classroom, schools, and student learning. And so we view this as both an opportunity and mobility enhancement, but also, again, to strategically align and think about how we can make strategic investments in our schools. And finally, again, starting with those 600 students, we think that is a significant but conservative first step in making sure that we do this in a thoughtful, deliberate manner, that the students that we shift in that first year have a high quality and effective ride on the Indigo network, and demonstrate to our students and families the quality and as the student mentioned and my former classmate Kiana, there's a lot of students and families who have never ridden the Indigo, and so there's a degree of just familiarity and acclimation that we want to make sure that we're building that culture of riding at the schools that are impacted, that we're really having an opportunity to really support those students in the summer and into the beginning of next year with route planning and what does it look like to get on the Indigo bus. So we'll talk a little bit later about what some of those supports and engagements would look like, but want to make sure that we're really executing on that in 21-22 really well, working with Indigo closely and making sure that that is a positive experience for our students and families. And so thinking about how this looks in year 2, year 3, year 10, we want to make sure that we start with a record of success and make that a positive experience and gives us something to build on in subsequent years. I'll just briefly pause here. That's a lot on Indigo. So if there's any immediate questions that you have on Indigo, we'll go ahead and take those now before we get into the walk zone review.
Yeah, Zach, thank you for doing that. Commissioner Arnold.
Thank you, Zach. So can any student who lives within the 1.25 walk zone, if, say, they lived 1.2 miles away from school, but lived relatively close to a bus line, will they be eligible, or are they excluded if they live within that 1.25 walk zone?
Right. So currently, we're limiting eligibility to students who are on yellow bus transportation services. So a student who would be a walker designation is within the walk zone of the schools are not participating, not included.
But we have not been enforcing the walk zone previously for high schools. Is that correct?
inconsistently. There are walkers at schools. Some of the work we'll get into is having reviewed all of those walk boundaries, reviewed hazard boundaries. So there are walkers at schools currently.
But not every student that lives within the 1.25 is currently walking. Some of them are getting yellow bus now just because
Correct.
they have, and
Right.
that hasn't been enforced.
That's
And they
correct.
will not be eligible for bus pass.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
They would have received it for safety busing. If they lived inside the walk zone, they would have received it for safety busing. That's similar to our elementary and middle school students.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Any other commissioners with questions while we take a halftime break here before we move on to the next component of transportation discussion? Commissioner Slack, I'm looking at the phone here to see if you have a question. I can sense one.
Well, I do have a question for you. Thank you, President Hawkins. I appreciate that. Now, so when I'm looking at slide 15, it says that we're going to be recommending that the kids that are less than 50 minutes total time is the only kids that we're going to be targeting right now, correct?
Correct. Those would be the only students who meet those three criteria: 0 transfers, 0.7 total walk, and no more than a 50-minute transit for that initial year one shift. So these are students that we would shift onto Indigo, no longer provide yellow bus service, but we'll do some targeted outreach to other students, and obviously any student may opt in.
Okay, so then we are letting the public know that this is a transition. This is a step to a transition. So not everyone's going to have this idea framed, correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the
Commissioner Slack, can you repeat that question, please?
So what I'm trying to get us to tell the public is that this is our first step. So as we transition with Indigo and our partnership, this is our first step. So not every student's going to see this idea criteria, say, the next year and the next year after that, correct?
Correct, that's right. So again, we're recommending that in this first year in 21-22, and when I say first year, obviously we've had a 3-year engagement with Indigo, 2 years of a full pilot. So year one of sort of this new next step in the shift will be limited just to those 600 students who meet those criteria. That's correct.
And we also are letting the public know that, according to slide 14, that the passes that we were providing before for all the high schools are not going to be provided for all the students, just for these 600 students that we're recommending, correct?
That's correct. So the recommendation would be to provide an Indigo pass to the 600 students that we've identified based on that criteria, to any high school student who opts in and opts out of IPS Yellow Bus service, but then to no longer provide the Universal Transit Pass to all IPS high school students.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that I highlight those two criteria because I don't want anyone to get the idea that we're not telling you right now up front that this is what the recommendation is. Thank you so much, Zach.
Thank you, Commissioner Slack. Commissioners, any additional questions for Zach? Commissioner Collins.
Thank you, Zach. I know you've spent a lot of time and effort on this, and in general, I think it's a good thing. But did we ever talk about liability if a student is hurt on a public bus? Would we be? What's the liability that IPS has, and as well as Indigo?
Yeah, we've had internal conversations with IPS attorneys and have initially discussed this with Indigo. But I mean, to your point, that same concern about safety and liability is where we've had 150,000 rides the last 2 years, and so it's kind of a similar concern and consideration with respect to the current planning. But with respect to next year, obviously, we're working with Indigo to kind of think about what that next iteration of that agreement with Indigo and talking through and considering what that means with respect to those types of issues, and so continuing to have those conversations.
Well, having ridden on Indigo before, then as an adult, and way back when I was a kid, but there are times when it could be difficult, and I just hope that that the leadership considers all safety issues and the concerns of parents of letting their kids go to a public source for transportation to school. And so I just hope we get all our ducks in a row as far as safety issues go. But
Absolutely.
thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, no questions. Zach, again, I'll echo Commissioner Collins' comments, and I know this has been a heck of a lift, and we appreciate all of your work and Scott and your work as well on this issue. I guess a couple questions really is related to sort of thinking about students with special needs and things of that nature. I guess for, as a parent that may have a student with special needs, would this protocol apply to a student with special needs?
Right. So any student that has a transportation attachment or a transportation designation, either through McKinney-Vento designation or because of it's a part of a IEP, would not be included in that 21-22 shift. So those students would not be included in that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. That's an important clarification, I think, particularly for those that might be tuning in, to know that this is a focused, sort of targeted, I'll call them the frequent flyers or frequent riders, that it sounds like this sort of step in, as Commissioner Slack mentioned, that's what this is a first sort of step beyond pilot, sort of the opportunity to have the Indigo Pass and the Yellow Bus. This is sort of a next generation of that. With, in addition to that, an opt-in option, as I read, for students that may want to. I know the young man that presented to us at the last meeting talked about how much he appreciated the opportunity to be flexible in his daily learning life. And so it sounds like there's another opportunity there to market that, and maybe there might be some students like Iliad that may choose to do that, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And to that point, I know that the student that was here, mentioned sort of this idea of kind of a buddy system or some safety support. And I think that, that's a great idea that she mentioned, and something that we're thinking about with respect to, obviously, there are going to be some clusters of students that are riding and congregating on stops together. So one, we're working with Indigo to identify kind of those stops and routes that are expecting to have some higher number of students, to make sure that we're supporting and planning around that. And one of the things that we've looked at for the current school year and looking at for next year is identifying students at every school to serve as student ambassadors. So she doesn't know it yet, but one of the students here tonight will probably be getting an email follow-up soon to think about that. But identifying students who, are great student voices for that, who there may be a student who's a little nervous, hasn't ridden Indigo, but means I can tell them it's a great opportunity, but it means a lot more coming from a peer to say, I was nervous too, and I rode it, and now it's great, and it lets me get home after volleyball practice and in the summer. And so identifying kind of student ambassadors at each of the programs that can help serve at that, and as we do kind of those touch points and information sessions with students, can be there as a student voice to help talk them through and be a resource for those students. So working on that as well.
Appreciate that. And I guess the last question is certainly don't want to miss the fact that Senate Bill 141, I think CEO Evans presented, I think moments after her testimony, or after, some decisions had been made at the State House about the future of funding associated with Indigo. And so don't want to just discount that, how it might relate to this as well. But what is your sense relative to Indigo's ability to support this sort of step-in plan? I know that funding is really, as I understand, more dedicated to the future build-out of the Purple and the Blue Line. But as it pertains to the grid that exists right now, what is your sense or take on Indigo's ability to deliver in this sort of step-in plan?
Right. No, it's a great point. We've had those conversations with the Indigo, and obviously we had the Inez Evans here come and speak with you, and we're continuing to be in conversation with them, and obviously monitoring the Senate Bill 141 and potential impact from that. In our conversations with Indigo, as we think about what this looks like for next year, we're confident in the students that we're shifting next year will continue to be able to serve through the existing Indigo network, and that regardless of the status or outcome of that bill, that won't impact the existing network. And as you indicated, a lot of that will depend on on the ability of Indigo to think about the expansion of the network and the blue line and purple lines. And so there's potential impact in subsequent years as we think about which students could be served through Indigo. But with respect to next year and the current students, we don't think there'll be any impact on those students.
Thank you.
All right. So the second significant initiative that we've looked at with respect to transportation.
Hold on, Commissioner Slack, go ahead. You surprised me there a little bit. Go ahead.
I had another question. I'm sorry. I look at the slide 17, and could you walk me through that, Zach? I'm a new student, and I'm coming into IPS, and I'm one of the students that need to be riding Indigo. How do I know that this is a route and what route to take? How do I know what bus to get on? Who's going to tell me the direction to Indigo? Like, who's going to navigate me on that? Is it going to be solely the parent's responsibility, or is it going to be IPS is going to give me recommendations? How is that going to play out? Could you walk me through that?
Great question. So we're in the process, and there are already some existing resources, not only in the IPS webpage, but at the school. And so we had come to speak to us tonight, Ms. Davis from Crispus Attucks, who talked about a little bit about how she supports that and engages students and helps them navigate that process. So every school has a point person, someone who is designated to monitor the assignment and activation of Indigo passes. Again, if a student loses a pass or has an issue with Indigo, it has a point of contact at their school to help them navigate that. And so for a student that would enroll and meets one of these criteria, again, if it's a student that would be in that sort of the more robust, the one transfer, 1 mile, 60 minute, we would obviously provide them information about what their ride would look like and give them opportunity to opt in. And if they're in the mode shift students, again, make sure that they're well supported with respect to where their Indigo stop would be and what their transit journey would look like. And so we'll have additional supports at the schools to help facilitate that at every school.
Okay, that's kind of what I wanted to walk through. Thank you so much. I echo Commissioner Collins when I say that I hope that we have everything enrolled, because as a parent of IPS and putting kids on buses, I worry about the liability of our board. So as we can get everything together as much as possible, which I know that you're trying, and I appreciate you so much with your work, Zach.
Commissioner Moore.
I have two short questions. The first question centers around, so if I remember correctly, like when school first starts, or before school first starts, we're going to allow those 600 children and their parents to be able to ride Indigo to capture, I can't talk today, to capture the ride that's going to be from their home to their school. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the families will be, prior to school starting, they will kind of have a feel for what the ride's going to look like.
That's right.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. My second question is, and don't ask me how long ago it was, but when I was in high school and we were bused to various schools, we all rode the Indigo. And it was one, they had one bus and they stopped at various stops, and it was only for IPS students. And I understood the mother to ask that question, and she said, could we consider that? Is that a possibility, or do they consider that to be like, almost like just riding the yellow bus going to IPS?
We haven't specifically discussed that or raised that issue with Indigo. I would think that's probably not an option given their existing network. I'm happy to raise the question with them, but I think that's probably not an option.
Okay. And I understand that. So I guess what I would say is that I would like for us to raise that option, because, when we ask parents to give us a suggestion, what would make them feel better about first things, if they say so, and then we go back and ask, and we can come back with a response, then that makes people understand that we take seriously their concerns as they try to work with us in collaboration to ensure that we have enough funds to be able to educate their children. So I hope we will consider asking that question.
And I appreciate
But they
that.
made us do it a long time ago.
Right, absolutely. Well, and to your point, so again, there's some, it's been some number of years before, since IPS has done that, but lots of urban school districts rely on public transit, and so we would certainly be in good company with respect to large urban school districts. Cincinnati, I know, has a robust program in partnership with their local public transit agency that supports daily student transportation. And even with Indianapolis, obviously, we're 2 years into a pilot, so over 150,000 rides of IPS students on Indigo buses. And again, those Indigo buses are not IPS only dedicated. And there are a number of charter schools within the city that don't provide yellow bus service, and their students solely rely on Indigo network. I know Purdue Polytechnic and IndyMet and several others that provide similar passes to their students who utilize that. And so there's not only within historic precedent, but current schools that are doing this, but obviously nationally, there's a lot of precedent for thinking about student safety and liability with respect to utilizing public transit. So,
Commissioner Allen.
Yes, thank you, President Hawkins. Have the Indigo bus drivers been trained on like human trafficking and kind of what the signs are for that?
they have a great question. I didn't specifically speak about some of the sort of safety provisions with respect to Indigo, but all of their buses are equipped with cameras, so video cameras that monitor buses. They have trackers so that they're GPS tracking all of their buses in time. And to your point, all Indigo bus drivers are trained to identify the signs of human trafficking. And so that recently came up in a conversation with Indigo that just noting some of the safety training and supports, not only from a technology and infrastructure, but in terms of how they train and support their drivers.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on. Thank you, Zach.
All right, great. So again, the second significant effort that we're looking at is with respect to our walk zones. And so IPS Board Policy 8600, which was approved in 1998, established walk boundaries for all of our schools. And so based on the type of school, the policy states that IPS will provide transportation at no cost to students as follows. And so for elementary school students, this is students who reside more than 1 mile from their assigned school. For middle schools, students who reside more than 1.25 miles from their assigned school. And for high school students, students who reside more than 1.5 miles from their assigned school. So functionally, that means if you live within those boundaries, you are not assigned yellow bus transportation service. The exceptions to that would be obviously any student where transportation is a part either as a state or federal requirement, McKinney-Vento students, or is part of a IEP plan that requires transportation supports as a part of that plan. Additionally, as Mr. Martin mentioned, there are hazard boundaries within these walk boundaries. And so what our team does is use that 1 mile or 1.25 or 1.5, builds a walk boundary around each school, but then identifies hazard boundaries that would serve as a limitation on that walk boundary. So you can think of this as an active railroad crossing or an expressway, a freeway. We look at the nature of the road and what the average travel velocity of the traffic flow on that is, kind of traffic volume. And so based on that, we'll assign codes that designate hazard boundaries. And so to the extent you live within a walk boundary but are precluded because of a hazard boundary from walking safely to your school, those students would be provided buses, hazard safety buses and those students, to the extent we can't mitigate a hazard boundary through a crossing guard or some other mechanism, would continue to be served and provided yellow bus assignment. One of the reasons I think historically, so again, this policy's been on the books for a number of years, and for a number of reasons, through exemptions and exceptions to that policy, through sort of creeping hazard boundary designations in there, and through a reduction in some revenue supports for crossing guards, as crossing guards have been pulled back. More and more students that are currently within existing walk boundaries have continued to receive yellow bus assignments. And so what one of the big pushes on this work was last year when we were managing the impact of COVID-19 and trying to think about how we could safely transport students to school, how we could think about physical distancing in our buildings and all of the disruptions and safety and support measures that we were planning with respect to COVID-19. One of those was looking at how we could reduce our daily ridership. And so the CDC passed guidelines last year about trying to ensure physical distancing and spacing on buses to minimize the risk of transmission. And so we did a number of things to try to support student safety on buses. So obviously enforce mask wearing. We provide PPE to our monitors and drivers. We provided hand sanitizer so that students getting on the bus received hand sanitizer. We, when possible, always had the buses down and ventilation to promote ventilation on buses. But CDC guidelines recommended that we try to achieve a 1 student per seat seating arrangement on buses, which significantly limited the number of students we could transport on our existing fleet. And so we had to be really creative and move pretty quickly to think about how we could reduce daily ridership and try to achieve that physical distancing to promote student safety on buses. So use a number of strategies. We implemented a transportation opt-out survey to families last year, and so asked those families who could provide transportation to their students or students who are opting into virtual education to opt them out of transportation so that we could reduce ridership. But those efforts alone weren't going to get us to where we needed to be with respect to trying to achieve, get in alignment with those CDC guidelines. So one of the things we did last summer was looking at those established walk boundaries and seeing how many students were currently routed on yellow buses but still living within those boundaries. And so at 13 schools last year, we already implemented it and executed those prescribed boundaries. And so shifted about 2,200 students for the current school year that were previous yellow bus riders in 1920 school year, and deployed about 40 crossing guards across those 13 schools to support student walking across those schools. And so that was a first step in doing this. And again, same process by which we were reviewing, auditing those walk boundaries and aligning it and ensuring they were applied across schools consistently in alignment with board policy, reviewing and assessing those hazard boundaries and making sure that they were appropriately designated and ones that may not be, making sure those hazard boundaries were accounted for, and then looking at strategically where we could put a crossing guard to support student safety at those 13 schools. And so did that for last year. And so hoping to execute on that across all schools in 21-22. So again, same process of reviewing those walk boundaries, evaluating hazard boundaries, determining where appropriate crossing guards could help support student walking at those schools. And we're expecting about between 5,500 and 7,000 students to be designated as walkers for the 21-22 school year. We think about 2,000 additional students. So I noted at the 13 schools are about 2,200 students that were impacted last summer as we implemented that for the current school year. We think there are about 2,000 additional students as we implement this across district. And so again, you'll notice 13 schools, 2,200 students, and 2,000 at the remaining schools. And so there really is a lot of differentiation, both because of the enrollment patterns at schools and also just as a function of hazard boundaries and what those look like at schools. So also just noting that you'll notice that's a pretty big gap between 5,500 and 7,000 in terms of what we're expecting that to look like. And just wanted to flag kind of the reason for that uncertainty with respect to the what that impact looks like is some of it, we're in the process of validating and verifying enrollment for next year. So we're in the middle of the second round of our enrollment process. So students and families are continuing to make their enrollment choices for next year. Obviously, lots of our 8th grade students thinking about what that high school assignment looks like. And during the current school year, we had a number of students who are opted into virtual education or opted out of transportation. And so we are doing the process of doing outreach for those students and families to determine what their decision is with respect to transportation services for next year. And so some of those transportation opt-outs were probably directly related to concerns about COVID-19 or just efforts to help support our efforts to reduce ridership. And so wanted to make sure that we're thinking about what decisions those families make. And so we're working through that process to see the impact. Finally, notice that again, as we make those designations, and so we will be in communication with those families, letting them know about potential shifts in terms of their transportation service, particularly for those families who may be expecting to get a yellow bus assignment for 21-22, but based on this analysis, have been identified as a walk student for 21-22, making those communications and outreach to families. And we'll continue to employ a walk zone exemption process. And so specifically, we obviously want to make sure that we have up-to-date, accurate information about their residents so that they're appropriately assigned in our transportation system. But also if there are individual, unique circumstances, medical or health issues with the student that we want to take account for, that we're thinking about that. And if there are any particular neighborhood or walking conditions that we may not be aware of. So think about, we may have a hazard boundary and it assumes a certain walk path for students to that school, but if there is a large construction project that disrupts that, obviously we want to make sure that we're tracking that as a team, but can't always catch everything. So if there's something unique about the neighborhood that changes the status of that, we want to make sure that we're reviewing that. And so there'll continue to be a process for families to request a review of that process. Pause here if there's any questions on the walk zone. One final thing, we have been at a series of, Andrew Strope and I and the superintendent have had some conversations with some school leaders and principals, and so previewing some of this for those school leaders to let them know of the potential impact on their schools and their students. And so I've gotten some good questions and good feedback from school leaders as we think about how we can implement this in next year in the least disruptive way and the most effective way as possible. Because we know this will be a shift and a disruption for some students and families. And so we want to be thoughtful about how we can support schools in implementing this at their schools, and also what information and supports we can provide for students and families to make sure that we're being sensitive to their concerns and feedback.
All right, thank you, Zach. Commissioner Arnold.
I would just like to note I was not a member of this governing body when the walking boundaries were established.
Duly noted.
Do any other commissioners have any questions or comments for Zach? Commissioner Slack, don't want to leave you out.
You must always know I'm going to have a question. Okay, I did have a question, Zach. When we talk about the walk zones, is there going to be some type of communication with you and the city? So if there is anything that happens in the city where it disrupts the route for kids to walk, that we will be notified, or is it a way for parents to contact transportation to let them know that there's a disruption from the path or something for kids to be able to walk through safely? Just infrastructure issues that may happen.
Yes, absolutely. And so I know Scott Martin follows that pretty closely in terms of road construction. So obviously it's a concern on the bus routing side as well, as are there going to be road closures or things that disrupt our routing assumptions. And so I know Scott Martin and Dietrich Taylor, our Director of Transportation, monitor that pretty closely. And so to the extent that is relevant and impacts the walk zones, we'll obviously want to make sure we're staying abreast of that and following that. And also Scott Martin, Chief Operations Officer, and I have been in contact and established kind of communication channels with DPW as we think about sort of what those issues might be. And so if there are particular neighborhood issues that come up that we want to flag to the city and just be in conversation with them, that doesn't mean they can always mitigate it or we can always solve it, but making sure that we're just staying plugged into what those issues are at the school level and the neighborhood level, and to the extent that we can help support students and families in schools in navigating that, trying to push in on that where we can.
That's Jerry. I mean, I really appreciate us putting out the crossing guards and things of that nature. I'm really, really concerned about the safety of the kids walking, especially when they walk in the morning and it's dark outside. So definitely, are we going to have signage out there? So say there's a crossing walkway with the cross guard, are we going to have signage out there? Tell people to slow down, or is there a way for us to contact the city and have them get on those kind of issues for the busy streets that we have?
We have conversations with DPW about specific issues. I know there's been issues that have popped up around schools with concerns about kind of what the pedestrian supports, surrounding those schools are. And obviously, we can't put up signage, or modify the streetscape in any way. But to the extent there are issues that come up and we're aware of, a tree obstructing the vision or where there's safety road hazards that can be mitigated, obviously we want to know about that. So both our students and families and schools alerting us and also just us identifying those, and to the extent we can mitigate it or communicate those concerns to the city, obviously we'll be proactive in doing that.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Allen.
Yes, thank you, Zach, for all your hard work on this. I know you've been working on it for quite some time. Can you talk a little bit about what the parent engagement has been as we came to this decision and what it's going to look like as we move forward with this decision? That's my first question.
Yep. So we're planning to send out communication, letters to families in the next week or so that just notify them if there are going to be change of status. And so particularly we want to target those families who have been getting a yellow bus assignment that they would no longer, based on our analysis, no longer receive that yellow bus assignment in the 21-22 school year. So really want to make sure we're reaching out to those families early to alert them of that, and so we can start that conversation, make them aware of it. And then through April and May, the end of school year, really working with schools and thinking about what those school level supports are, so that as we think about walk zone implementation in August when we come back to school, kind of the safe route to school. So kind of what Ms. Davis at Addix has done for the Indigo students is thinking about working with school leaders to identify, clusters of students that, obviously with concerns about walking and safety, to the extent we can have a group of, 8 to 10 students walking together and doing that, getting in the practice of doing that daily walk together, helping identify those students and provide some materials and supports for school leaders and schools to help facilitate some of those supports as well.
Thank you. And then my second question is, do we have any data particularly around like sex offenders in relationship to those walk zones or our schools?
We don't specifically have data on that. I know there are public databases that track that information. We sometimes have parents who reach out with questions or concerns about that process, and it's something that we always review and take into consideration as we think about this. The challenge is there are lots of public databases where you can review that. It makes implementation of walk zones challenging in terms of how you account for that with respect to specific exemptions.
Commissioners, any other questions for Zach? I will ask you, so I think what I'm clarifying or understanding here, I guess, is that we started, the parameters were set when Diane Arnold was not on the board back in 1998 relative to the walk zones for elementary, middle school, high school. That, I don't want to say enforcement, but the sort of the annual review process did or did not occur, which sort of that number grew, right, outside of there as those exceptions were made. And so I'm just curious, as you're thinking about this going forward, what does the annual or semi-annual review process look like? Because there will be certainly exceptions that happen, and just thinking about how do we, as an organization and as a community, sort of avoid potentially this, not to say that this is what happened, but I mean, just how do we avoid and maintain some levels of accountability to make sure that we're coming back? So I'm curious how you're thinking about that.
Right. So obviously the work that Deetra Taylor and the transportation team has done in concert with our first student partners has been really important in just building in our system what those, aligning those walk boundaries to board policy and reviewing those hazard boundaries. So a lot of heavy lifting this past school year and evaluating those and making sure. So a lot of that heavy lifting will be done on an ongoing basis. Obviously, hazard boundaries, they're not permanent, right? So we will do that hazard boundary assessment and review on an annual process. And so there could be a hazard boundary that is mitigated. So I'm thinking about, for example, 38th Street is a hazard boundary. We wouldn't have a student walk across 38th Street. However, Indy Parks has just completed a significant pedestrian bridge over the top of 38th Street. Well, and I don't believe this impacts any of our students specifically, but just as an example, that would be something we would take into account if, obviously we wouldn't want a student to walk across 38th Street, but now there's a pedestrian bridge, pedestrian supports that would mitigate or remove that hazard boundary. So we'll think about, as infrastructure changes, how we're auditing and reviewing hazard boundaries. And conversely, if there are new hazard boundaries because of an expansion of a roadway or removal of pedestrian supports or otherwise that flags that, and we'll obviously want to make sure that those hazard boundaries are consistently and appropriately designated in there. And then with respect to student assignment, there is, particularly with respect to crossing guards, reviewing that on an annual basis to see, again, where are students enrolled, residents, in terms of where they're coming from, and making sure that crossing guard is strategically deployed to support the most students. And there are some hazard boundaries that can be mitigated by a crossing guard, but that requires a little bit of a work in determining how many students could be supported through that. And so obviously if there's only 3 or 4 students, that probably wouldn't, it wouldn't justify deployment of a crossing guard to support crossing for those 3 or 4 students, so they would continue to receive a safety hazard busing designation. And so I think a lot of the heavy lifting has been done, and I wish Dietra and the first student team was here to give them credit, because they've done all the behind the scene work of digging through databases and Edulog and working through maps and mapping, and so done a tremendous job doing some of the heavy lifting. And so on a going forward basis, I think the hard work is done, but there's obviously every year going to be an annual process of reading those hazard boundaries and making sure student assignments are appropriately assigned.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, we'll move on to the final bucket. I think it's the most interesting, is route optimization. And so with respect to route optimization, we're really thinking about how we transfer the given number of students on the bus fleet we have in the most efficient, effective manner. And so this was part of the work and the scope of work that we had planned to do with our first student partners as we entered into that engagement last year. And some of that work, as I previously mentioned, was significantly disrupted by COVID-19 last year. So we went from thinking about how can we optimize route, how can we increase bus utilization, to how can we get students off of buses, how can we make sure that we're implementing the physical distancing on buses. So picking up a lot of that work that got disrupted last year and beginning to think about our route optimization work. And so really there are kind of 3 components to route optimization. One is route optimization, which is just how that bus gets assigned to pick up. So making sure that in terms of the total time and the total distance, that it's doing that in the shortest and most efficient manner. And so thinking about how we route those buses. The second one is stop consolidation. And so looking at the number and location of our bus stops. And so the fewer bus stops we have and the more students per bus stop, the more effective and efficient our transportation service is. So doing a stop consolidation and stop audit that's looking at bus stop assignments and making sure that those are placed in the most effective and efficient way. And then finally looking at pairing. And so we run a 2-bell system. So a fully paired system would mean every bus is running 4 routes. So running at the first tier AM and a second tier AM, and then has a first tier PM and a second tier PM route. And so because of routing and because of some of the unique start and end times, we're not able to pair every bus. And so kind of looking at opportunities to better pair and through routing optimization, get higher utilization out of those buses. So continuing to do that work and know there's a lot of opportunity there. And this in some ways, all three of these efforts, the Indigo, the walk zones, and the routing optimizations are all complementary of one another. And so, to the extent we reduce ridership through Indigo and through walk zones, it gives more opportunity for us to think about how we can reduce routes and cut buses. And so we're currently running 305 buses for the current school year. As recent as 2015-16, I believe we were running 417 buses. So we've already done some significant, as Superintendent Johnson outlined early, some efforts to reduce some of the spend there, but we still think there's opportunity there in the coming school year. So I think I'm giving it back to Superintendent Johnson here to finish us with kind of reviewing timeline, next steps, and some of the engagement and supports that we'll do for these recommendations.
You are. Thank you. If we'll go to the next, will you keep driving for me, please? Thank you. So we know obviously this is the beginning of larger and more substantial engagement that we'll do in our school communities. And so wanted to outline for the board a timeline of different actions that'll be taking place between now and really the start of the next school year as we socialize these transitions for our students and our families. You can see between now and specifically April, before we ask the board for formal action on the recommendations, ensuring that we're informing impacted families of this proposed shift, getting feedback from them, and then after the time, assuming the board's approval, we'll continue to work during May, June, and July with ongoing communication, community engagement efforts. Ashley Scott, who leads our community engagement team, is here this evening and is already doing some of that engagement with community organizations and others to support this effort across all of our school communities so that we are ready to go at the start of the school year in August. To be a little bit more granular, in this next week, we will actually send a letter to families who would be specifically impacted, outlining the changes and where they can learn more. We already have a transportation page that is live on the website with lots of information, FAQs as well for families to reference. We'll have those multiple town halls and information session opportunities for students and families, having those Indigo ride opportunities so that, to Ms. Peacock's point, she can get on and see what it's like for her child and, walk to the stop and just get a sense of what it would be like, along with developing whatever other additional supports that we hear from principals and families that would be helpful for them to have. And so all of that is underway. And so, essentially, what we want to ensure that we are conveying is that we are committed to the financial sustainability of the district in the long term, and we want to do it in such a way that reduces the impact to our classrooms and our teaching and learning opportunities, that we are recommending these transitions for the start of the next school year, again, so we can address some of the fiscal problems that we're facing, and that while we are determining those strategies to address that deficit, we want to ensure that what we prioritize does not negatively impact, again, our classrooms, our teachers, and the learning experience of our students. And so that has been the priority and will continue to be as we leverage and continue to navigate our fiscal landscape. Stop there and also invite any questions about our next steps around communication and engagement.
Questions from commissioners? All right, thank you, Superintendent Johnson.
Thank you.
President Hawkins, if I might, I just want to note there is action required beginning in April for approval with respect to the transportation policy. So you'll notice in board docs in your materials, there is a red line version of the current board policy 8600 that just updates that to reflect the recommendation with respect to the Indigo shift. And so just includes a language about providing that in lieu of yellow bus for eligible students. So made that minor adjustment to the policy to support the recommendation. So needs to lay on the table for 30 days, but wanted to flag that to your attention. And I did make one other substantive change to the transportation policy, and this was as a result of some questions that we got from principals as part of the sessions that we had this week, which was for our K-8 schools, how are those students treated if you had a middle school student at a K-8 building? And so how we handle that as a transportation team is a a K-8 building is treated as an elementary school, and so even if you're a 7th or 8th grader at a K facility, you are still designated a walker only at that 1 mile. And so we do that for a couple of reasons. One, just to avoid confusion in terms of multiple walk boundaries at the same school, but also so that we're being conscious of the fact that we're not disrupting families who have multiple students at the same school where a 2nd grader is a bus rider but a 7th grader isn't. So trying to make sure that that's not, it's kind of supporting transportation alignment for those schools.
Great. Zach, thank you for calling that out. And that is posted on board docs as well, both the current and then red line version, so I appreciate that. And just to clarify, this board will not take action, though, until April, and
Correct.
then decide at that point whether or not we would apply our custom 30-day wait after that. But it sounds like that's TBD in April at this point.
That's correct. We'll
Right.
come back in April, likely with an updated presentation with some of the feedback we've heard and questions that have come up and answers to those questions before we request formal action from the board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Item 7.02 is an update on an audit conducted by the organization Promise 54. As commissioners may recall, the district contracted with Promise 54 a number of months ago to conduct an equity audit of our practices that included document reviews, focus groups, and other reviews of district practices and protocols. This is in support of our racial equity policy and the work that we've been developing. That study is now concluded, and we're pleased to share some of the findings from that report with you this evening. So I will turn it over to Andrew Strope, Dr. Payne, and Sean Harris, who will facilitate this presentation.
Great, thank you, Superintendent Johnson, and good evening, Board of School Commissioners. We are going to provide an update, as Superintendent Johnson said, on the Promise 54 DEI audit. As we presented to the board summer of 2020 on getting this audit launched. And so as we come back this evening, we'll give a quick overview of what the project looked like. We do have some findings back, so I want to make sure that we are talking through those, and then we'll also identify some next steps. So alignment to the 2025 strategic plan. So strategic priority 2 is promote racial equity, strengthen and expand our work to eliminate opportunity gaps, and then underline the aligned policies and talent decisions to IPS's anti-racism agenda. We have presented to the board a number of times over the past few years with Dr. Payne and myself and others around focusing on mindset. And of course, that work continues every day, but also have to start pushing into policy and action. And so that is where we are moving. And then an aligned initiative that we were able to actually execute most of this school year, which was past the IPS Racial Equity Board policy in the Black Lives Matter resolution, which Dr. Payne will talk about a little bit more, but in that it outlines the specific work that we are looking to do with Promise 54 and hopefully carry forward as well. So next slide, Sean, thank you. So Promise 54, I think this was 2 years ago, Dr. Payne, that her and I were in Washington, D.C. for a DEI conference, and multiple other school districts were talking about Promise 54 in terms of the amazing work that they did around the country. And so we got linked up with them and got planning, and so are very excited that we actually were able to see this work through. They're a nonprofit talent solutions provider. Next slide, Sean. They work with a number of organizations around the country. This list continues to grow, but as you can see on there, Cleveland Metropolitan School District, the National Civil Rights Museum, as well as San Francisco Unified. And so they are very well respected in this space. I'll turn it over to Dr. Payne.
Very well respected. Excuse me. Purpose is a declaration of where we stand, an acknowledgement of our past, and a commitment to the future. So some of the related commitments are the district will strengthen and expand its racial equity work to eliminate opportunity gaps. We've been actively doing this, and disrupt institutional racist structures and policies within the district. Creating an infrastructure for all IPS members to have access to robust professional learning experiences around racial equity. And that is active right now. all IPS staff members are going through the racial equity training. And we have some board members here getting ready to go through it also. So we're excited about that. We also tried, in fact, it was yesterday, to involve parents, students, and staff in robust learning experiences. We learned some lessons. We had a few hiccups, but all in all, it went well. Foster organizational and school cultures that consistently hold space for conversations around racial equity among staff members. We have been doing a lot in principals meetings, in fact, to make people comfortable talking about race and racism. And that's kind of what's going on in the society right now. But in our school district, we find that it is getting easier and easier to hold these conversations, especially when all schools have school equity teams that can hold that work together within the schools. And then the Black Lives Matter resolution, initiating a racial equity audit, which is what we now have in collaboration with Promise 54 to help identify gaps and develop strategies for making progress towards racial equity in IPS. And so what we're doing now is lifting these words off the page and putting them into action.
All right, good evening, Board. Superintendent Johnson, it's great to be with you once again. Just to revisit the purpose of this project. So we tasked Promise 54 with conducting a diversity, equity, and inclusion audit on our talent systems and structures. And based on the findings of those audit, of that audit, they zeroed in on 3 focus areas within the district, which are recruitment and selection, onboarding, and career advancement. In regards to the methodologies that they utilize, they did an artifact analysis where they reviewed over 50 documents consisting of slide decks and other items that spoke to the district's mission, strategy, and efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Last year, we submitted a organizational profile, which just essentially just gave them some general information and data about IPS, and as well as a staff experience survey where we had over 2,000 responses. We also conducted over 10 identity-based focus groups in partnership with Ivy Tech Community College. They served as our facilitators, as well as interviews with our HR team. So based on the survey data and the focus groups, there were some themes that emerged from the data. And I just wanted to flag that as we reviewed this as a racial equity team, as well as with internal stakeholders, we found that there wasn't really a lot of surprise about a lot of the things that emerged. So in regards to the emergent things for the 3 categories, for recruitment and selection, there was a number of BIPOC staff, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. There was a lower number of school-based BIPOC staff compared to the benchmark organizations that they compared us to. And then also that BIPOC staff expressed a shock in regards to, I guess, like the diversity gaps in schools, and they would be hesitant to recommend others to work at IPS. In regards to onboarding, the themes that emerged with that the effectiveness of our onboarding process was lower than the benchmark organizations that they compared us to, and then that staff expressed a inconsistency of onboarding practices across the district, which led to a lack of clarity around responsibilities, access and resources, and understanding the values of IPS. And in regards to career advancement, there was a link between performance and opportunities and career advancement, particularly for Black staff and LGBTQ staff, that was lower compared to the organizations, the benchmark organizations. And then staff expressed a lack of clarity around factors informing advancement decisions, particularly for BIPOC staff. So within the three categories, Promise 54 captures some strengths of the district, some challenges, and then some initial opportunities to make growth. So in regards to recruitment and selection, they captured that racial equity is a key component of our strategic plan and district values, and that for this school year, our closed vacancies outpaced our open vacancies, and that equity is incorporated in some regard in our hiring practices. So an example would be the new teacher induction. All new teachers in IPS have to go through racial equity training. It's a requirement. In regards to challenges, they identified the competing priorities that principals experience as it relates to hiring, which leads to later hiring decisions in non-pandemic years. And then the percentage of BIPOC applicants has declined, specifically for K-8 buildings. In regards to opportunities, they identified current structures that we already in place and pushed us to review them to identify efficiencies. So that relates to like our applicant tracking system and then like specific targeted events for BIPOC staff. In regards to onboarding, racial equity is a core component of our onboarding process, as well as the presence of DEI as a core value. So we've seen racial equity over the last 5 years be elevated as something that is extremely important to the district. In regards to challenges, just the inconsistent practices in regards to onboarding, not only across buildings, but across the district, and just that lack of clarity around expectations and competencies in terms of new staff coming on and like having a really solid understanding on what's expected. And then in terms of opportunities, leveraging systems that we already have. So this past January, Cornerstone, which is our new learning management system, went live in January, and they recommended potentially using that as a tool to centralize onboarding, as well as providing additional professional development opportunities. And then also like building on the mentoring opportunities that we already have in the district around opportunity culture and seeing what opportunities we have to do something similar for central service staff and new hires. With career advancement, they called out the strong representation of Black staff, not only on the board, but in senior leadership positions compared to benchmark organizations. They also called out the clear pathways for advancement for school-based staff, and then partnerships with organizations like the Management Center being seen as a effective resource for managers. In terms of the challenges, just the lack of, or I guess like the perception of of transparency into the staffing decisions, and then also a lack of tracking specific identities. Example being our LGBTQ staff, which results in an inability to identify specific goals around like identity and demographic data within the district. Opportunities, we're seeing that some parts of the district are tracking LGBTQ data, specifically our student teachers. And then there's also like opportunities to learn from the opportunity culture pathways that we already have in our school-based staff, with our school-based staff. So in regards to engagement, we have done some internal engagement. So once we got the final report, we engaged with the executive leadership team, the Racial Equity Strategy Working Group, and the Superintendent's Staff Advisory Council. One, to just get initial reactions to the recommendations, and then also to get feedback on how we should be thinking in terms of prioritizing these recommendations. And then we're currently developing an action plan to leverage the Promise 54 recommendations in the 2025 strategic plan and strategic priority to promote racial equity. And we'll be coming back in the coming months with a updated outline on specific recommendations and next steps. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Dr. Payne to wrap us up.
Okay, so there's an ongoing focus in our school district on promoting a racial equity mindset, and the board just demonstrated that tonight with the resolution in support of Asian and Pacific Islanders. That was great. In addition, we have to commit to addressing our collective practices, actions as an organization. So we've engaged Promise 54 to conduct this audit and review our DEI practices with a particular focus on our talent practices. We are currently reviewing recommendations, and all of this will be mapped into our 5-year strategic plan.
And we are happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you all for that presentation very much. Commissioners, any questions for the panel? Commissioner Slack, don't want to. Go ahead, Commissioner Slack.
I would like to say I'm happy to hear about the work and the engagement that we're doing with this Promise 54, and to recognize our strengths and our talents and throughout the district. From looking at slide 9 and slide 10, I see that we're recognizing the challenges we had. We're going outside the organization and seeking Ivy Tech and other partners to do the focus groups, which is phenomenal, and just proud of what we're doing. So continue to keep doing the work. Thank you, Dr. Payne.
You're welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Slack. I'll ask again, any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Arnold.
It's very ambitious. There's a lot to consider. Can you be a little more specific on the timeline? It seems like 21, 22 is a long way. What are the steps and what's going to be going on to address the issues that were raised?
Yeah, so what we started on this past week, or actually last week, is taking an initial stab at like mapping out where these initiatives should fall. And something to call out is that quite a few of the recommendations that they submitted were work streams that were already in development. And an example would be launching affinity groups. So there's been a tremendous amount of work around that particular recommendation, and that's something that we're going to be able to roll out by next school year. So we're just trying to figure out the best way to identify which work streams are already aligned to the work that's already happening in the district, and then where could some of these fit in other work streams. So we're mapping out starting next school year all the way through 2025 or 24-25, just to like prioritize what we should get done first.
Would it be possible for us to say, get a quarterly update on where we are with the work? I mean, that seems so far out there. I would like, this is really important, and it really fits in with what we've committed to do for our district and our children. I can't speak for everybody, but I would like more consistent feedback on what are we doing and what progress are we making, as opposed to waiting till it's in this 24, 25. Hopefully I won't be here by then, but I think it's important that we stay on top of this. It's important. We're dedicated to it. We've done a lot of work. I want to make sure we stay as a governing body, that we know what's going on and where the challenges are and where the progress is.
Yeah, and we're building in, as we've talked about strategic plans, sort of that quarterly progress monitoring that we're coming back to the board and talking about where are we across those strategic priorities. So that's certainly something we want to make sure we're bringing to you all's attention, the community's attention, to your point, so we can see where do we have challenges that we have to keep working, and then where are we having successes and the impact it's having on our students.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Commissioner Pritchard.
Just to follow up on what Commissioner Arnold said, I think, in my humble opinion, this is one of the most critical things we're doing. So I would love to see it happen quicker. You know what, I hear you talking about over the next few years. I would love to see some parts of it put into place by the next school year as quickly as we can. So I just wanted to echo what Commissioner Arnold said. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think I can add on to that a little bit. I'm looking at the document now, as Sean mentioned, we're mapping some of the recommendations, over the next 4 to 5 years, but a lot of them will begin in this summer and heading into next school year and the school year after that. And so, as Superintendent Johnson mentioned, I think the idea was, chunk out some of this information, update you all with what the findings were, and then make sure we come back routinely with, here's what the recommendations were and how we are implementing that, this year, next year, et cetera. And so things will be starting very soon.
The other thing I'll just add quickly to that is we're not starting at ground zero with a number of these things. So you might recall Mindy's talent report that she gave last week at the work session. We have a lot of the infrastructure and platforms and those kinds of things in place. For example, moving to a new applicant tracking system that would allow us to track something like LGBTQ identity. So I feel good that we'll be able to get started and get some things implemented because we're not starting, at ground zero for many of the recommendations.
Commissioner Collins.
Thank you, Commissioner Evans, President Evans, sorry. It's getting late, I
Was it
guess. Who's that? No, sorry. I just wonder if there's a plan for implementing racial equity training for teachers. I know a lot have received it already, and it's a 2-day program. And as I understood it, it's only 20 people at a time. So what's the plan for getting everybody trained before school starts?
So some of the things that we've done is we've updated our what's the best word for it? Our master tracker. So prior to having to pivot to a virtual training due to COVID, most of the records were kept on paper. So we've completely digitized all of this, and we've got it set up to a place so we can identify specifically who has already gone through training, and we've been able to target which schools, not only just with our school-based staff, but also central services. And we are pushing people to sign up for the racial equity training. So we're hoping that once we are able to come back in person, then that number could be expanded, because right now we're able to do 40 at a time. And Dr. Payne, if I'm not mistaken, we're training like 2 to 3 times a week.
We're training for just about 4 days a week. And at the last 2 days, in fact, we are training community partners. Of course, they have to pay to be trained. But we're doing about 4 days a week to make sure that our staff members get through, and this is certified and classified staff.
Yeah, and I think as we look into the future, to Dr. Payne and Sean's point, we've really scaled it up this year and have the goal that we have set to get all staff trained by the end of next school year. Naturally, as you have turnover, there will be staff that every year over year that are new to the district that need to be trained. And so we'll keep an element of that probably monthly rolling through. And Sean and I had the opportunity through the Racial Equity Summit yesterday to have some conversations with parents and just getting a lot of requests for starting to open that training up for parents, which I think would be really powerful. And so we're having some conversations now as a team on what that could look like into the future to really start pushing this out external as well. So I think excited on where that could potentially go.
Okay, and I have another question. It's kind of general, I guess, but I noticed that in front of our racial equity stance, we have 1619. And I've read that entire thing through the New York Times, and I wonder if that's what we're talking about, some of that kind of historic truth that should be taught and everyone should understand, or were we talking about something else by using that 1619 designation?
No, absolutely not. What you said the first time when you read through it, because one of the most moving parts of the training are the dates, where they take people back to show them the policies and the laws that were put in the books intentionally to make sure that African Americans were held back. And we always use the Monopoly game, in fact, as an analogy, because if you start in that Monopoly game 5 hours behind everyone else, then you never catch up. So it's very direct truths to help people understand why Black and brown children are always at the bottom and why we are able to know they're going to be there even before the test is given. And this has been normalized. So that's the kind of teachings that they get. And they get the workbook at the end of those 2 days. as well as 21 days of all kinds of links that they can use. Also, each school is supposed to have a school equity team to hold the work together in the school following the training. That means disaggregated data has to be actively reviewed by gender and race. Also, we ask the school equity teams to make sure they know the history of their school. For instance, if it was Crispus Attucks, we know Indiana Avenue used to be filled with Black businesses, all kinds of Black businesses. What happened to that? Why is it that the Walker is the only standing icon now of that neighborhood? So there's many different things that the schools have to do following that training.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Collins. Commissioner Moore.
Thank you and all the work that you've been doing with that program. Of course, as you know, we all attended, and so I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to do so. But I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit different from the rest. We had talked about last year when we started talking about equity and whatnot, that we were going to look at the tools that our children utilize to learn, and we were going to evaluate them to determine whether they were culturally sensitive. Where are we at on that?
So we've done that work with ELA, obviously with the adoption that we did for ELA that's being implemented this year. That was an adoption through that lens of cultural relevancy. We will be up for a social studies and science new adoption for the 22-23 school year. So we'll be going through that process this next year. We'd be doing that review again through that culturally relevant lens for this upcoming school year.
So just for me, I'm a little slow. So can you help me understand what are we doing to, what are we looking at? What do we bring back to the table? What changes in the materials that we're providing our children? What have changed since we changed to this mindset and said we're going to do these things, make sure that people really understand their history, they understand their worth. What are we doing? What's different? So if I go into a classroom, would I see something different than what I expected from the past when I look at the materials that our children are utilizing?
I think in English and language arts, you would see something different because those are new materials that we just put into place this year. You likely would not see something drastically different in science and social studies, but because we're on the brink of an adoption, and we'll go through that adoption process during this next school year for the following year adoption, then you would see that shift in those two subject areas. I think as it relates to classroom libraries and those kinds of materials that individual classrooms see, that is a place of focus that's been around. What are the books that teachers are choosing that reflect the students they're serving? So you would see represented in those spaces more diversity as well. And then I think beyond just the materials, it's the practices that our teachers are using when they're engaging with students. So there's lots of conversations with our principals, our teachers around those practices that are culturally relevant and affirming of our students.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Moore. Commissioner Slack on the phone. Any questions for the team?
I don't believe none. I do want to have a comment, though, around the material. As a parent, I have seen a shift in the material. I know my kids are reading more ethnical books for their literature, so I want to say kudos to the switch in our materials and what we've done for our students. I think it's been a huge difference in being able to identify yourself in the material. I also want to say that I'm glad that Dr. Payne did discuss about the tracking. So it's not only relevant that we make sure everyone is trained, but it's also relevant that we make sure that everyone's using the material, which is very important, that we're having them implement the material along the way. So knowing that there's a team there at the school, I didn't know that. That's great information. I'm glad to know that.
Thank you, Commissioner Slack. I would echo that as a parent as well. I've definitely noticed and seen a shift. A different question is, we focused this presentation kind of stepping in on this audit on talent and recruitment and onboarding, et cetera, but there's so many other dimensions to the work. We know that, that our system includes how we, how students, particularly students of color, are disproportionately, suspended or disciplined, whether it be law enforcement. I know we've done some work around and continuing to analyze law enforcement practices across the board, but I'm curious what next steps or sort of what dimensions or what segments of the organization might be on deck for this type of in-depth analysis, because there's just so much to do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, Dr. Henderson, our Chief Schools Officer, isn't here with us this evening, but I think when we rolled out last school year, it was a central office and school principal leadership rubric. Is all part of kind of a performance management system, and we completely revised that to focus more on racial equity. And so, to Superintendent Johnson's point, the actions and the instructional practices that our educators use on a daily basis is really where it counts. So where we spend a lot of time is on mindset. And again, that'll continue to happen. What we talked about tonight, to your point, is around policy and practices, and in particular at central office, that we need to do a better job of. We have already started to push on teacher practice. And so I'm sure we can talk more at a later date around CT3 and some different partnerships that we're looking to engage in relative to honing in on teacher practices in the classroom and how that shows up relative to our racial equity mindset. So I think that's the next place that we're really going to hone in on. And again, I think Dr. Henderson could talk about that a little bit deeper. But that would be my response on that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dr. Payne. Thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. We look forward to coming back to the board and updating you on the progress that we make.
Thank you.
There are no items this evening in old business. There is one item in new business that we presented on Tuesday, which is the small purchases policy. I believe this policy will sit for the requisite 30 days before formal board action is taken. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, President Hawkins.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. And again, thank you, Dr. Payne and Sean and Andrew for that presentation. Moving on to section 10 of the agenda, commissioner comments. Does any commissioner have any closing comments or remarks this evening? I see Commissioner Arnold's hand.
Thank you, President Hawkins. I just wanted to give a shout out as the board representative to the IPS Foundation. They've done great work on behalf of our students in our district, and there are a couple of ways you can support them immediately. I have my shirt on tonight. Is it on the IPS webpage?
Pretty sure it is. Let me check very quickly.
I know it is on the foundation. It says, "Made for the Moment," and it's celebrating the basketball connection and all the activity going on this month in Indy. And I believe all the proceeds from the sale of the shirts will go to the IPS Foundation. And if you don't need a t-shirt, you can order between now and Saturday from Cluster Truck. Just go online. And I believe 30% of the proceeds will go to the foundation and then come through to help our students and our teachers through grants and other opportunities. I happen to live 4 blocks out of the delivery area, so I ordered last night and pulled up in front of this building and had my food delivered here. So if you don't live in the district, you can still figure out how to get your food. It's a great opportunity, but very much appreciate their effort. They've done great work on behalf of our students and our teachers and our district, and I hope that you would consider supporting them.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Do any other commissioners have any closing comments this evening? All right, I will just make a few comments, I guess, then. one, in general, I think just the transportation conversation, there's a lot there. And I appreciate, and I'm kind of going back in time here a little bit, so forgive me because it's about 8:30 and we've been at this for a few minutes. But I think, whether it be the budget appropriation adoption process, and thank you, Weston, and your team for the work that goes into that. We only see the very tip of the iceberg, but we know this is, nonstop. So we appreciate you and your team's work here. Also, transportation, Scott and Zach as well. And I think there's just the through line between all of these issues is going back to those slides about the conversations that occurred many, many years ago, whether it be prior to a referendum, during the referendum, and leading up to it, and then beyond that. And so just the connectivity between that and what we're also experiencing and seeing happening at our State House as well. And so I want to just, thank Superintendent Johnson for representing the IPS community and family today through her testimony today before the Senate Budget Committee, but also just in general, this is all connected. And so on that slide where you see the purple line and the green line and the red line, that purple line that holds up and stands tall and high on that chart is meaningful because that represents the opportunity to meet the commitment and the promise that we made to taxpayers and the community and teachers as well to sustain that compensation. And so, again, trade-off conversations, trade-offs have always been part of this conversation, but I just want to reiterate the importance of how all of these discussion topics are interconnected together. And frankly, they are difficult. These are uncomfortable shifts, and we recognize that. And I think all of us will continue to listen to feedback from parents and from community members who will digest this presentation and presentations that we've heard today. But I want our community to know that, and we certainly will listen and want to receive that feedback. But also, I want to make sure that we don't miss, and I appreciate this being in the presentation again, that we don't miss the connectivity of all of these factors in play and how they affect our ability to deliver on the highest possible outcomes for our young people and our students. And I think I see Commissioner Allen hand up as well for a closing comment.
Yes, President Hawkins, if I'm in order, I would like to read a memorial. Memorial to Jesse C. Hawkins, Jr. Whereas Jesse C. Hawkins, Jr. served the Indianapolis Public Schools from 2019 to 2021, whereas his years of dedicated service contributed positively and significantly to the Indianapolis Public School District as a whole, and specifically to the students and staff members at Short Ridge High. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Board of School Commissioners of the City of Indianapolis that the death of Jesse C. Hawkins, Jr. be memorialized and that a copy of this memorial be sent to the members of his family. Jesse C. Hawkins, Jr. was a valuable member of the Strings program at Short Ridge High School and is greatly missed by students, parents, faculty, and staff members. Mr. Hawkins wanted to give students of all backgrounds, but especially students of color, an opportunity to excel on the violin and viola as a result of his lifetime experiences. Mr. Hawkins wanted to give back to a community similar to the one where he grew up in North Carolina, which he did through numerous tutoring opportunities and group instructional sessions. Mr. Hawkins attended the prestigious North Carolina School of the Arts. His career includes first violin in the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra 1974 to 1976, the Concerto Soloist of Philadelphia, and a playing member from 1977 to 1984. Principal second violin in the Opera Company of Philadelphia Orchestra from 1977 to 1986. Member of the Santa Fe Opera from 1978 to 1988. First violin in the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra from 1986 to 1988. Principal second violin in the Fort Wayne Philharmonic in 1988 to 2000. For all of his greatness as a violinist, Jesse's most lasting legacy will be as a teacher. Mr. Hawkins was a pillar of the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. In his position as principal teacher with the MYO, he transformed the lives of hundreds of kids, many of them within the IPS family. His love for the gift of music, which believed everyone possessed, has been given to those kids and has enriched their lives and those of their families forever. He has been a role model of all role models, a violinist of all violinists, and his warm smile will be missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Allen. If there are no other commissioner comments this evening, I will hand over to Superintendent Johnson for closing comments.
Thank you, President Hawkins. I want to thank Dr. Payne and our district equity team for their leadership in hosting the Racial Equity Summit yesterday. There were several notes of appreciation and gratitude that I know the team received, and it was a powerful day of learning. I also want to thank our team members who were here to share their perspectives and feedback on the recommendation of our transitions in transportation. We know that the next several weeks and months will be important as we both inform and support our families with these proposed changes. Additionally, I arrived at this meeting a little bit late because I was providing testimony at a school funding subcommittee meeting. I want to thank a group of teachers from Shortridge who hosted a teach-in at the State House today and conducted their remote learning at the State House, giving their students a direct insight into what it means to advocate and use your voice. I also want to thank Commissioners Allen, Pritchard, Hawkins for being present to support our district in advocacy today. I think I got everybody who was there. It's important that our community understands what is at stake with the decisions that legislators will make about funding our schools. While the overall average increase to all K-12 schools would be 1.25% and 2.5% respectively over the next 2 years, Indianapolis Public Schools will see a decrease of 0.3% in year 1 and then a slight increase of 0.8% in year 2, for a net total of less than a 0.5% increase from our current funding over the next 2 years. The current funding model would provide no additional dollars to support students who have additional needs and are the farthest away from opportunity. As I shared with our legislators earlier today, they are steadily moving toward a model of equality instead of equity in funding. And that would be justifiable if all of our students were starting at an equal place. But we know that that is not the case, and therefore an equal funding model cannot be justified. To decide to continue with this lack of investment for students who most need it, students who receive special education services, students who are English language learners, or students from a low-income household, against the background of a pandemic and at a time when schools who are committed to serving all students with all needs and have worked in innumerable ways to make education possible for them this year. To continue to operate with this model of equality for funding is simply unjust. So I share this with commissioners and the greater public so that we can all be aware and use our voices to advocate for our students, our families, and our communities. All of our students are worthy, and we will continue to advocate for them. Finally, as we head into spring break next week, I do want to wish our students, our families, and our staff a wonderful and restful break. Please use next week for renewal and recovery, and then we look forward to seeing all of our students back on April 5th, at which time we'll also welcome all of our middle and high school students back for Monday through Friday in-person learning, if that's the model that they have chosen. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. Our next scheduled meeting is our work session, which will be on Tuesday, April 20th at James Whitcomb Riley, School 43. Having completed all the items on the agenda, this meeting now stands adjourned.